Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to just start with a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, very important that we do have interpretation today in English, French, Spanish, and sign. There's a globe at the bottom that you can use for different languages, and you can pin international sign so that it remains a central window. I want to remind you that this session will be recorded. We will be using the chat to share information, but unfortunately it's not possible for participants to send messages through the chat. And we have a very full program, so we will not have a question and answer function for this session as we did for everyone. So I want to start by thanking UNESCO, the government of Portugal, and Leonard Cheshire for organizing this symposium on rebuilding a stronger global disability inclusive education system post-COVID-19. There have already been two very full and rich days of presentations and discussions, and we're very excited to be starting this closing plenary session. This session follows earlier ones that dealt with policy, with teaching and learning, and with safe learning environments. And we heard a lot of very important messages. We heard inspiring stories from persons with disabilities, from government representatives, from academics, and from representatives of multilateral agencies. And we heard, very importantly, that inclusive education is the only way to respect the human rights of learners with disabilities. But I think equally important, we also heard that inclusive education is best for all learners. We also heard some other messages, though. We heard that in 40% of countries, and this is data that comes from the recent Global Education Monitoring Report 2020, in 40% of countries, disability laws are the ones that govern inclusive education. So unlike the title of the Global Education Monitoring Report, inclusion is not for all. In 1 out of 4 countries, children with disabilities under law need to be educated in separate schools. And less than 1 out of 5 countries call for inclusion of all in education. So what we want to do today is to look at how we can translate what we've heard over the last 2 days to rebuild more inclusive systems after the COVID pandemic. And to help us answer that question, we're very lucky to have a group of exceptional speakers. First of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Diane Richler. I'm the co-chair of the GLAD Network Inclusive Education Working Group. I'm also a former chair of the International Disability Alliance, a past president of Inclusion International, and chair of Inclusion International's Catalyst on inclusive education. The speakers that we have today are all eminent. A book could be written about any of them, so I'm only going to say a few words of introduction. First, we're going to hear from Professor Mel Ainscow. Mel is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Manchester in the UK, and also Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and Honorary Professor of Practice at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. He is definitely one of the foremost promoters of equity and inclusion globally. The panel today will be made up of Julia McGowan. Julia is the Global Inclusive Education Specialist and Team Leader for Inclusive Education at Humanity and Inclusion, which was Handicap International, and coordinator of the Inclusive Education Task Group of the International Disability and Development Consortium. She has 18 years professional experience, including overseas experience in the education development sector. Dr. Robert Prouty holds a PhD in educational administration with an emphasis on African studies. He was head of the World Bank's Global Partnership for Education and lead education specialist at the World Bank. Throughout his career, he's given particular attention to inclusive classroom context and learning outcomes, and what it takes to ensure that all children have access to good quality learning outcomes. Dr. Joseph Murray is the president of the World Federation of the Deaf and a board member of the International Disability Alliance. He's been involved with human rights work for 2 decades as an advocate and as a scholar. He's professor of deaf studies at Gallaudet University and has written extensive publications. And last but not least, Charlotte McLean-Lapo is a human rights lawyer and currently is the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group. Her work at the bank focuses on disability inclusive development under its twin goals to end poverty and promote development. Promote shared prosperity. In her past, she was appointed by President Nelson Mandela as a commissioner to the South African Human Rights Commission, focusing on social and economic rights, disability rights, and child rights. But before we hear from our speakers, we're lucky to have Julia Hayes, the illustrator, who's going to present a visual image of the previous session. Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Diane. So yes, welcome everybody. As this fantastic conference and inspiring words that we've heard from people has been going along, I've been listening and drawing the images that I have found that captures the content. So I'm going to take you through a speedy summary of what we've had. So at the opening session, we thought about how do we ensure the right to quality, inclusive education for persons with disabilities. We had the opportunity to have an overview of the Global Educational Monitoring Report, the GEM report. We also looked at some inclusive systems with examples from Ethiopia, from Portugal, and from Nepal, and how they'd managed to implement those systems. Finally, we looked at COVID and the impact that that is having on children with disabilities and all those who are in marginalised groups. And then we move to the next session. Next slide, please. So the next session, we focused on legislation and how you can move from legislation to inclusive practice. This was a time where we looked at the PEER website, which gives an overview of inclusive education and how people are doing around laws, as you heard Diane refer to earlier. Also, then we heard of some inspiring examples from Portugal, from Namibia, from the West Africa Federation of Persons with Disabilities, what's happening in Moldova, various ways in which people had used laws in order to change systems and to have a genuine impact upon the education of children with disabilities. Finally, people gave their recommendations, moving from commitment to action, focusing very much on supporting teachers and making sure that everyone's voices is at the table. Next slide, please. We then had a session where we were revisiting teaching and learning processes, thinking about how can we ensure access and participation for persons with disabilities. This very much focused on the need to support teachers, as was mentioned in the previous session. And we had examples of how we might do that. So we're saying, yes, training is important, but it's got to be more than training. Teachers need ongoing support and ways of working together that builds on national experience. And also we talked about some examples of online learning and massive online open source courses. So there was reference made to courses, for example, the TEDdy courses at the University of Cape Town, and the various ways in which we can use technology to reach teachers, but also to reach children. So it's having a range of modalities that enable all children to learn. But the important thing is to find ways to make these accessible. And there was a young man called Leon who pointed out that nothing is impossible if young people are heard and considered. And to the next slide, please. Then yesterday, we looked at moving towards inclusive and safe learning environments, about addressing violence and bullying for persons with disabilities. On this side, you can see on the left of the graphic, we had a very, very up-to-date overview of where bullying is at, what the research is telling us about bullying. And it's telling us that children with disabilities are as or more likely to be victims of bullying as non-disabled children. And we found there are various other intersections that impact upon children and whether they're more likely to be bullied. We thought about the different kinds of bullying, and then as was pointed out, if dreams are crushed at school, it robs children of their future and it robs us of future advocates. So then we moved on to thinking about what helps and had some interesting examples, practical examples of what could help to help children in schools to make sure they feel safe, and the ways in which their peers can help them, and a focus on care more than competing. And I'm going to illustrate the last session today, and you will all get a beautifully professionally scanned version of all of these. If you want to see more on them, you can look on Twitter, #inclusioneducation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful visual representation and an excellent example of differentiated instruction and how we make sure that people have opportunities to learn in different ways. So thank you, Julia. I'm going to turn over to Mel now and ask him to introduce our theme for the day, which again is rebuilding a stronger global disability inclusive education system post-COVID-19. Mel, over to you.
Thank you, Diane, and hello to everybody. As others have said during this event, it's clear that the pandemic has thrown further light on challenges and difficulties that were always there across the world. What it's thrown light on, particularly in terms of our agenda here, is the way inequalities within societies are reflected in and reproduced by education systems. So it points to the fact that we need a renewed commitment to notions of inclusion and equity in order to make sure that we make some progress. I've been fortunate over the last 30 years or so. I should explain that despite my youthful experience, I'm quite old. Over the last 30 years ago, I've been fortunate to be associated with UNESCO and worked on a whole series of international developments, initially around the notion of education for all, then the emergence of the idea of inclusive education, and then, of course, we stress the importance of inclusion and equity. And it's allowed me to work with education systems in different parts of the world, including my own, of course, working along policymakers and with practitioners to say, how do we transform education systems? How do we move them forward? And I just want to sort of point to some general messages that I've learned from all that work, which I characterize as a kind of collaborative action research, where we're trying to learn by doing. In 2017, UNESCO published a report which is called A Guide for Ensuring Inclusion and Equity in Education. If you've not seen it, it's available on the UNESCO website, and the link is on the chat that you can get access to. The document was created by a group of experts, and I was the kind of chair of the group. And what we tried to do was to bring together the best knowledge as to what you need to do to analyze and move an education system forward, seeing inclusion and equity as a process. There are always strengths to be built upon, but there are always new challenges. One of the conclusions that we came to, and which is strongly emphasized in the document, is that because this is so complex and requires the involvement of so many players, we need clarity. And the document tries to give clarity to what we mean by inclusion and equity in education. And it sums it up in a sentence, which I think is a very useful kind of banner headline for our work. What it says in the document is this: every learner matters and matters equally. Every learner matters and matters equally. That, it's, to me, captures what we should be using as a principle to guide everything that we do as we're moving forward. When I'm working with governments, I say to them, listen, don't have a policy for inclusion. It shouldn't be a separate policy. It should be a principle that informs every policy. The curriculum, teacher education, the allocation of resources, the assessment system, everything should be guided by the principle of inclusion and equity if we're to move forward. The second thing that comes out of all my experiences in different places is that context matters. It's not simply the idea of borrowing something from one place and take it to another place, although of course we can learn from other people. Context matters, and we have to analyze every context, whether it's a classroom, a school, a district, or indeed a national education system. And the argument that I will put forward is in analyzing the context, we need to identify the barriers that are limiting the participation and learning of some of our children. Now, barriers can take many forms. It's a metaphor to make us think. Some of them are to do with policies. The curriculum can be a barrier. if it doesn't plan with all children and their interests and their concerns in mind. The assessment systems we use to determine progress can be barriers if we don't celebrate the progress of all children, some of whom may be making slower progress. The limitations of our own teaching expertise may be a barrier that we need to do something about. And then perhaps the most difficult barriers to identify and barriers to address are the barriers in our minds, the limitations of our own experiences, the prejudices we have, the belief that some children can't be involved, can't participate and can't learn. If those attitudes and values are there in people's minds, then progress will be difficult. So this is about reaching out to people and helping them to rethink their concerns. So analysis of context, the use of evidence, statistical evidence, of course, but also qualitative evidence. That's why voices are so important. Everybody's views have to be looked at and listened to, not least the views of children and young people themselves. So this is about addressing barriers and requires a collective effort. In my own work, we use a kind of framework. We call it the ecology of equity. And it's a simple idea. You need to look at what goes on within schools, particularly what goes on in classrooms. You need to look at what goes on between schools, because schools can collaborate or they can compete. But where they collaborate, that can extend the range of resources available to schools. And of course, we have to look beyond the school gate. We have to work with families, we have to work with the communities, we have to work with businesses, universities, religious organizations. The number of potential players that can be involved in this are extensive. So it's a process of improvement, mainly school improvement. And what I say to people sometimes is, this is about school improvement, but it's about school improvement with attitude. It's school improvement based on certain values and belief, the belief that every learner matters and matters equally. In the school improvement world, it's sometimes said that school improvement is technically simple, but socially complex. It's not that difficult to list and describe what actions need to be taken. I've already summarized some of them in this short discussion. That's not the difficult bit. The difficult bit is to get everybody to agree and share a common view and move together. That's why, of course, leadership is so crucial. We need collective leadership at every level of an education system. Of course, we need it from governments and ministers, that's important. We need it at the regional level and at the district level. We certainly need it at the school level. People in senior positions have a crucial role to play. But never forget, as far as education is concerned, the most important policymakers are teachers. When the teacher goes in the classroom for the next 50 minutes or hour or however long it is, as far as the children are concerned, the teacher makes the policy. So in moving an education system forward, we have to take teachers with us. And in fact, we have to go beyond that. We have to recognize that teachers are the keys to success. It's therefore not surprising that the most successful education systems in the world have a common feature. That feature is that in those countries, teachers are valued. They may not be the highest paid people, but they are valued, they are recognized, and they are supported in the important work that they do. So in moving forward, it's a process of bringing everybody together, all the players I've mentioned, others that I've perhaps overlooked, but particularly we have to pay attention to the development of teachers. One final point, Diana has already said it, but I want to reiterate it. We also know from research that an emphasis on inclusion and equity is the road to excellence. If you want to have an excellent education system, you have to concentrate on the participation and learning of every child. Remember, every learner matters and matters equally. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent introduction, Mel. We knew we could count on you. You've really framed the situation very well for us. And I think that your comment about inclusion and equity being a process, any system that says we're fully inclusive is not really seriously thinking about the improvements that they can make. And one of the words that I heard over the last couple of days that I thought was really important was the need to be reflective. And what you are talking about when you talk about learning by doing is that systems that really make progress are ones that are self-critical, think about what the next step is, and are always ready to move forward. I also think that your comment on teachers is very important. And sometimes when we talk about inclusion, we're only thinking about the students, but teachers need to feel included too. And one of the messages that we heard from the Global Education Monitoring Report is that inclusion can't happen top down. Everyone has to be participating. And teachers have wonderful ideas and can bring excellent resources to the table. But that's when they're included as part of the process and not being forced to do something against their will. I'm going to turn to the panel now, and I have a separate question for each of them. We're going to start with Julia McGowan. And Julia, I'm wondering if you can talk about how we can make education systems more resilient to pandemics, and how to make sure that children with disabilities are at the heart of preparedness responses. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks very much. If you could move it forward to the next slide, because I wanted to give the first answer being it's through multisectoral approaches. I think this is really the number one key factor. This question is specifically about the barriers for children with disabilities, although of course we acknowledge that inclusive education is for all children, as Mel just said. But I wanted to answer this question with the multisectoral approach at the core. And I just wanted to mention that IDDC that I'm representing here today is a network of 30 organizations very much promoting this approach. And it's been particularly working on this since the COVID pandemic started. And I'm going to put some various resources to support after this intervention. I think really the first thing to point out is that collaboration needs to happen not only across policy areas, but also between stakeholders. It's crucial that it's from top to bottom, from international level right down to local level. And coordination at all levels is absolutely the key. We need to ask ourselves, as NGOs, for example, working in this field, are we working in silos? Is the education sector consistently working with the health sector or the social protection sector, for example? Because when it comes to preparedness for events such as pandemics like COVID, we need to make sure that children with disabilities are included across all the response plans. So let's take in mind three key things: disability data, disability criteria, and disability accountability. So we need to make sure that children with disabilities are counted in the planning for preparedness. We need to make sure there's sufficient criteria in any response plans so that authorities can indeed be accountable to their policies on disability inclusion. And sadly, during this pandemic, we haven't seen that to be the case in many of the education sectors around the world, although many of them have been trying to some extent to include children with disabilities, but it's not been across the board and it's not been comprehensive. I think with this, we can learn from the humanitarian sector. And indeed, in recent years, there's been a real surge of interest to try and promote a nexus approach. So linking the humanitarian and development sectors, which in the past have themselves been really more siloed approaches. I would just point to a couple of useful resources on this. And again, I will post them in the chat. The Interagency Standing Committee on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action did some useful recommendations and guidelines with a chapter on education. For example, including the organizations of persons with disabilities in coordination mechanisms during response plans, for example, making sure the voice of children and families of persons with disabilities are included. They also talk about working with cash transfer programs, coordination with nutrition actors. There's a variety of ideas and checklists and tools that can be used by the education sector to make sure that as we go forward, there's a fully comprehensive approach to response planning and preparedness for future pandemics. So I think that's the key. If I could quickly just to finalize this, go on to the next slide, which is an infographic to show the child very much being at the center. Because if we're developing this multisectorial approach, it's crucial to keep the child in mind, because we therefore make sure that we're going from the needs first. So as you can see in the infographic, the child is at the middle, and those furthest away, the edge of the circle, are those often have the most power, but are furthest away from the child. In terms of the ministries of education, ministries of social welfare, they often would have power to be able to change the available budget and services that can be provided for the child, but they aren't the closest to the child. And as was just said by Mel, you know, the teachers, the parents, all of the community around the child are the key, really. So it's just to highlight the intersectionality of all these different actors. And just to finalize, I wanted to mention some useful resources that I think can be helpful. I think that people have come together during this time to try and develop supports and guidelines. And finally, I would mention that in HI, we've just launched a report actually specifically on trying to break down the siloed approach. So looking at what can we do to support disability inclusion in a post-COVID world, working together in a multisectorial way. So I will end it there, Diane, and pass back to you.
Thank you, Julia. That was really helpful. And I think that you definitely pointed out the real life, the lived experience of many children with disabilities during the pandemic, which is that while education sectors may have been prepared to deal with going forward with some education, they really hadn't necessarily been prepared to include children with disabilities, and particularly children with different disabilities during the pandemic. So I think that, you know, we've seen examples of programs, distance education being used that would not be suitable for learners who are blind or for learners who are deaf. We've seen very little specialized attention to making sure that learners with intellectual disabilities and with psychosocial disabilities are being included. And very often what's needed in order to make sure that all those learners are addressed is the kind of cross-sectoral approach that you're talking about, which is really helpful. None of these things will happen without thinking about how funds are allocated, how resources are allocated. And we're lucky to have with us today Bob Prouty. And Bob, I'm going to turn to you now to see what you think has been learned about the importance of funding as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And what steps do you think governments and donors could take to better fund inclusive education systems that are responsive to the needs of and rights of children with disabilities as we move forward? Over to you.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you to those who've spoken already. I want to make 3 points about funding for inclusive education. And these 3 points are going to fall into the categories of good news, bad news, and a special category of not really news at all. The bad news first. Funding for inclusive education before the pandemic, during the pandemic as well, has been far too low. And we can be optimistic, but there's every reason to believe that it will continue to be far too low following the pandemic. The good news, we do have some good practice examples, and there is a lot we can do to build back better, regardless of financing constraints. And in the category of not really news at all, we need to be aware that it's possible to do harm Now, that's not news to you. You know it's possible to do harm. But there are some funding decisions in the current context in particular that could move us in the wrong direction. You know, this isn't a new concept, but it's interesting. We know the phrase, you know, from Hippocrates, "First, do no harm." Interesting that that phrase actually came from his book of the epidemics. So it's particularly important in the current context. Now, I just want to spend a couple of moments on each of these points. On the bad news front about low financing. Pre-COVID financing from government budgets was already low for everything. 1/3 of the ODA eligible countries had tax to GDP ratios under 15%. Now that sounds maybe overly technical, but it matters for funding education in general and inclusive education, because as Mel said, we're part of broader systems. We can't think of this as entirely separate. And the tax to GDP ratio of under 15% is considered the absolute minimum, essentially, for states to function at all and to be able to finance really much of anything. Certainly not enough for education at acceptable levels, and certainly not enough for inclusive education, which is very sensitive to overall levels of financing. Prior to the COVID crisis, debt in the previous decade, debt service in low-income countries had doubled as a share of budgets. Again, inclusive education financing very sensitive to government budget health. And now, post-COVID, World Bank has just produced an analysis. They expect that government revenues will decline 12 to 16% for several years post-COVID. And it's worse than that right now in some places. For instance, in Peru, in April, government revenues were down 40%. In Jordan, government tax revenues down 49%. The World Bank also projects that the share of the budget for education in general will decline in the first several years after the pandemic to make space for essential funding for health and social protection. All of this to say is that it's challenging for government budgets going forward, and it's going to be challenging for inclusive education that depends on government budgets. And what about private funding from individuals, from households, a huge source of funding in many countries? In fact, the largest source of funding for education in many developing countries. Well, just a couple of months ago, a survey of 17 countries mid-pandemic showed that 45% of the households had a member who had lost a job. And for the poorest households, that number went up to 71%. Okay, so I'm giving you bad news. Let's go to some good news. On the good news front, donor support for education was on an upward trend pre-COVID. For the first time in a decade, we were seeing more money coming in for education from external sources. And we had an example of best practice. NORAD was providing 29% of its education funds for inclusive education. So donors, it can be done. Also during the crisis, GPE has been providing funding as a COVID response for education, almost $500 million. And of that $500 million, just over 3%, 3.3% has gone for inclusive education specifically. That may not seem like a lot, but if much of the other funding is going for system strengthening, that 3% is a good start. That's the part that's dedicated specifically to inclusive education. Now, on the not news at all front, about the possibility of doing harm, there are some funding decisions that can hinder inclusion, and we're seeing some of those in the pandemic context. For instance, some countries, some donors, pushing for ability tracking as a way to get systems going immediately post-COVID. And we know that ability tracking will harm the most vulnerable. We also know that most funding for distance education has ignored children who can't access computers or even radio instruction. We need no-tech as well as high-tech and low-tech solutions. We also have an issue that we've seen, that most donors provide their funding, or many donors provide their funding only through government systems, and not always with necessary safeguards. And that means, and we've seen this, I'll give the example of Central African Republic, for instance, during the pandemic. Community finance schools in some countries constitute more than half of the children going to school, and almost always the most vulnerable. In the pandemic, we've seen community schools, community finance teachers struggling to get any financial support whatsoever. And these things do harm because they widen the gap between the most vulnerable children and others, and they hurt children with disabilities. So if we're going to build back better, some things need to change. I'll just stop with this. We'll need to take a twin track approach where we pay attention to systems as a whole, better tax systems, more funding coming in for education, and also we need to pay more attention to targeting funding to disabilities, to inclusive education. We may have a chance to talk about this a little bit more later on, but systems approaches where we pay attention to funding overall, where we pay attention to pre-primary education, to the language of instruction used at the school, to getting finances to the school level, to funding teachers in community schools, to more funding in humanitarian contexts. These things make a huge difference for supporting inclusive education systems, and we need to give them a lot more attention. Donor systems need to change too. Where we have budget support, we need to have safeguards in place to make sure that inclusive education is not left out. We need good earmarked funding, and we need better attention to broader systemic issues. The good news, we can build back better, even when resources are scarce, as they very likely will be going into the immediate future. Some low-cost changes can make an enormous difference. It really can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, and an amazing job of fitting, excuse me, a tremendous amount of information into a short time. I really like your dividing things into bad news, good news, no news. And I think in some ways it's the your reflection on funding decisions that actually harm inclusion. Their inadvertent consequences are really not planned for consequences of many of the decisions that are being made. And so certainly, for example, when donors are deciding to have their funds for education go only to government schools, it's not a deliberate plan to leave out the poorest, but that's the impact. When education systems are thinking about ability tracking and a need to move to what's often called teaching at the right level, they're not thinking that in fact that could potentially lead to segregation. And so again, I think you're really raising the question of how we reflect on the impact of all of these decisions, always using inclusion as an issue in our minds in terms of what how these decisions are made and what the decisions are. And I think that your reflection on a twin track approach, often the term has been applied at a much more particular level, thinking about the need within education systems to fund
Right.
special to make sure that the system overall is inclusive, and to make sure that there are also accommodations being funded for learners with disabilities. But I think you've really brought that up a level in terms of thinking about the overall funding structure and how to make sure that that has a twin track approach as well. All of our speakers so far have made some reference to organizations of persons with disabilities. And so now I'm happy to turn to Joseph Murray to help us think about how we can amplify the participation by and the voices of organizations of persons with disabilities at the global, national, and local level to respond to the global challenges such as COVID-19, and how to think about interventions at global, national, regional levels can be better coordinated between international agencies, governments, and organizations of persons with disabilities. Over to you, Joe.
Hi, Diane. Thank you very much for the question and the kind introduction. Going forward, how do we build back better? Well, first by recognizing shared responsibility for inclusive education. This means all stakeholders in inclusive education need to include organizations and persons with disabilities at all levels. From policy and planning to implementation, and from assessment and monitoring to renewal of education systems into quality education systems. The International Disability Alliance recently released an Inclusive Education Global Report, which outlines the conditions required to build an inclusive education system geared toward providing quality education to all children and youth equitably. This report is an important moment in our joint disability advocacy for a truly inclusive education for all learners. The Inclusive Education Global Report reflects both the spirit and intent of each paragraph of CRPD Article 24. This report is a clear cross-disability consensus that shows the unified view of the IDA's 8 global and 6 regional networks, providing us with a way forward to achieving SDG 4 for all learners. The report calls upon governments to make significant investments in inclusive education, and this effort should be done in compliance with CRPD Article 4.3, which means OPDs need to be consulted at each step. An important point from the report is that whether managed by public or private sectors, all education facilities must be regulated by ministries of education or relevant ministries for inclusive vocational training, early childhood development, and lifelong learning. Organizations of persons with disabilities have important roles to play here. For one, OPDs can and should play a key role in defining what we mean by inclusive education systems and being involved in the shift toward such systems. Education reform with a view to equitable participation requires governments and professionals to actively engage at the community level. In order to determine the strengths of each community and their preferences. OPDs, families, and communities should be engaged in participation and feedback mechanisms on the local and national levels to ensure all schools are providing quality and inclusive learning for all. Communities, families, parents, and learners must be active participants in monitoring and evaluation activities. This means, for example, evaluation criteria should be developed in consultation with OPDs and organizations of caregivers in the case of children with intellectual disabilities. Indeed, OPDs and persons with disabilities need to be understood as frontline resources within communities, schools, and systems. We need to learn to see people with disabilities as tremendous resources. Also, in humanitarian and emergency situations. To take one example, the world's largest refugee camp, the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, there are 3 schools that provide sign language-based education for the deaf children. All their teachers are deaf, and all, save one, are themselves camp residents. Peoples and organizations of peoples with disabilities are resources for building inclusive and equitable education systems. Donors and external funding sources should ensure their inclusive education initiatives comply with SDG 4 and the UNCRPD by making all funding contingent on disability inclusive provisions aligned with the 10 recommendations in the IDA's global report. In Building Back Better, we need to understand what actually happened. Therefore, we need to actualize the numerous calls for reliable data about the impact of COVID-19 on inclusive education, disaggregated by age, sex, and type of disability. Data analysis and reporting should be done in consultation with those on-the-ground organizations of people with disabilities and their families to ensure this data accurately reflects the priorities and needs of people impacted. As president of the World Federation of the Deaf, I met our now 127 national associations of deaf people to learn about what the national level response to COVID-19 has been. What I found out was that these deaf associations quickly mobilized to provide critical support to the public and to governments. These organizations were providing access to information in national sign languages and assisting governments and families of deaf children how to ensure continuity of equitable and accessible education in national sign languages. The same is true for other organizations of people with disabilities, and many are doing so on minimal budgets and with overstretched volunteers. You can read more about the global disability response on the IDA's website. In order to secure a robust civil society response, it is important that OPDs on all levels, local, national, and global, have the necessity, financial, and human capacity to be equal partners in IE initiatives. This means disability inclusion in inclusive education initiatives must be properly budgeted for, giving OPDs the capacity for meaningful participation. Let's build back with stronger and more robust participation mechanisms that ensure OPDs on all levels have the necessary financial and human capacity for meaningful participation in building a quality, inclusive education system. And these participation mechanisms should allow for joint policy formation, which acknowledge and build upon the lived experience of people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I encourage people to follow up on Joe's suggestion and check out the website of the International Disability Alliance to read the paper that was developed. Listening to Joe, I was thinking about Bob's earlier comment, do no harm. And one of the things that the organizations of persons with disabilities learned during the negotiations of the UN Convention, that the task force that produced the IDA report lived up to, is that we were very conscious that as long as different organizations of persons with disabilities were presenting different perspectives, it would be easy for governments and donors and other organizations to play us one off against another. And that we made a decision during the negotiations of the convention that no organization would promote wording, particularly with reference to Article 24 dealing with inclusive education. No organization would promote wording that another group saw as harmful to themselves. And it took us a long time to come to the consensus. And similarly, the work that produced the report that Joe referred to took a long time to develop. But through the development, I think each of the organizations that participated learned a lot about the way other organizations of persons with disabilities and families of particularly children with intellectual disabilities saw the how inclusive education should be interpreted. And so we've come to a consensus. And I think it's very important when we work at the national and local levels to recognize that if we just consult with one organization, or if we don't give the groups a chance to really form a consensus, that we're not being fair to the disability community. And we really have to invest in making sure that the organizations can come to a consensus that makes sense for them and that they can then bring forward together. We're going to keep moving along, and now we're going to hear from Charlotte. And Charlotte, we have a very particular question for you about how we can make sure that education systems continue to develop an individualized approach to learning and focus on learning outcomes for all during and after pandemics. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. It's really great to be part of this closing panel. And I just wanted to start off by saying that the pandemic has caused seismic shifts in everything that we do. And it's really laid bare the fault lines of inequality in education, but also in other sectors. I think this was a point well underscored by Mel. Its impact on the education ecosystem appears in three significant buckets, so to speak. The first is the learning setting, the fact that children have moved from school to home. The second is the method of education delivery, from in-person to remote. And thirdly, of course, the whole issue around participation to promote learning. I'd like to reiterate the point that access to equitable and quality learning means that every child, whether they have a disability or not, can participate in education programs during and after the pandemic. We know that remote learning, particularly online learning, has been prioritized by many governments, even though we know that 47% of learners worldwide do not have internet at home. This remote learning paradox is even more challenging for learners with disabilities who may not have limited access to the internet and learning devices, but also no access to learning materials in an accessible format. And very often, these children with disabilities, come from poor households. So to Bob's point, it's really important for us to think about both high-tech and low-tech solutions. We recommend that remote learning interventions, whether they're online, broadcast, TV, or radio, should align with the universal design for learning principles and use the twin track approach to disability inclusion that you mentioned, Diane. This would require governments and development practitioners to consider universal design features from the onset and allow children to receive and respond to and engage with learners in multiple ways. And it should focus on interventions that allow for students to continue to think, to develop skills, and very importantly, to grow while at home. As you well know, Diane, the World Bank released an issues paper called Pivoting to Inclusion, Leveraging Lessons for COVID-19 Crisis for Learners with Disabilities. This issues paper was developed under the Inclusive Education Initiative that I manage, and it provides concrete and practical recommendations on how the twin track approach can be effective in ensuring mainstreaming disability inclusion, and also developing very specific activities to support the diverse needs of children with disabilities, including the individual needs of children with disabilities. We must also keep in mind, as we think about providing these supports, that despite our best efforts to make programs accessible, there's inherent inaccessibility in every educational endeavor. And so finally, and more specifically to the question, I would say that to promote individualized and address inaccessibility, governments and development agencies should consult with local inclusive education teacher training institutions, work with local special education and resource teachers, to a point that has been raised by every speaker, work closely with organizations of persons with disabilities and others, so that they can truly begin to look at ways to individualize remote education for those children who still face barriers. A point highlighted, I think, by Julia. So it is recommended that in these circumstances, implementing organizations should absolutely rely on experts. And these experts should be professionals, teachers, persons with disabilities themselves, and very importantly, parents. And this will help determine how to design and develop the best individualized specific interventions for children with disabilities. This is essential if we want to ensure inclusive education and if we're truly serious about building back better. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I wonder if we can get links posted to the papers that you refer to, so that people can take a look at them, because they certainly expand on your ideas. I think that one of the things that you pointed to is that there are a number of players that often are not considered as we think about making changes. So you talked specifically about teacher training institutions. Often there's such a lack of synchronizing between what those institutions know and can contribute and plans that are made by governments and by others. So your comments about the need to involve a broad range of actors certainly is consistent with the message that Julia delivered. But I think your comments were more specifically related to the education sector. And I think that your comments too about the need to consider the different range of challenges and issues that learners with disabilities might face was really important. And that universal design, as well as universal design for learning, really needs to be considered from the get-go. And any government now that is making plans that do not take those issues into consideration is on a path that will not lead to inclusion. Well, we were lucky to hear from each of the panelists, and we deliberately kept their comments brief because we wanted to pose a couple of questions that could lead to some discussion, and hopefully have them also refer to comments that were made by some of the other panelists. I'm going to turn to Bob first and ask Bob, how can we make sure that interventions to evaluate and address the impact of COVID-19 towards reaching the 2030 targets, especially the education targets, take into account all children with disabilities and the objective of leaving no one behind? Can you give us your insights?
Diane, I want to give you a striking number. The average number of children out of school at any given point during the pandemic has been about 50%. It was as high as a little over 80%. Now it's about 15%. Average 50%. But that's also the share of children with disabilities out of school all the time. So it's as if children with disabilities have always been in the midst of a pandemic and always will be, unless we take their pandemic as seriously as the COVID pandemic. And I say that because I want to use the term earmarks. Earmarks have become a dirty word for some donors, and they shouldn't be. We've done it for COVID. We can do it for inclusive education. We can do it if we decide to do it. Donors need to make sure that children with disabilities, that inclusive education overall represents a focused population in grant packages with money being set aside. Budget support operations, which can do a lot of good, but budget support operations for education, all of them must support inclusive education. There can be no exceptions, and donors can find a way to do that. And of course, governments in their own programs, in their education sector planning, there must be no exceptions, and we can do this. We need to define inclusive education in terms of a minimum package, and we need to completely abandon the idea of low-hanging fruit, this idea of doing easiest things first for the children who are easiest to reach. No farmer ever made a profit by picking the low-hanging fruit first and then coming back for the rest, and it doesn't work in education either. Charlotte mentioned universal design. I'll just stop with that, reinforcing that. Universal design from the beginning is much less expensive and much more complete than trying to retrofit things afterwards. Thank you.
Charlotte, do you want to comment on that further? Just thinking about the steps that the World Bank is taking, that the Inclusive Education Initiative are taking in terms of evaluating and addressing the impact of COVID?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Diane. I would absolutely. I think, you know, a couple of things. I mentioned the issues paper that we put out, and I think the issues paper really tells us, as I said in my remarks, it points to issues around the necessity for us to ensure that we have a social inclusion lens to this as well. It really is important for us to ensure that social protection systems are in place to support families. Many of families with children with disabilities are going to be amongst the poorest. And so having these systems in place are very important. We need to think about innovative ways, as I pointed out, to think about how families receive education materials. And again, back to Bob's point, we need to think about both high-tech and low-tech options because of the countries in which we work. I think there's also an important issue around making sure that we start thinking about new sources of disadvantage. Because I think what we're going to see as a result of the pandemic is a reinforcement of exclusion of children with disabilities. And so we need to be alert to that. And we need to be thinking about what this is going to mean in terms of their healthcare. So the decline in healthcare. We need to be thinking about, and the report, the IEI report points to this, we need to be thinking about nutrition and the status of nutrition for children with disabilities given the pandemic. And the fact that we will see induced poverty in many of these households. The other point that comes quite saliently from our report is the issue around a concern around the concern of reduced demand for education, and the sense that children with disability, many children with disabilities may not return to school. And this is truly a worrisome issue, and I think we should be thinking about this. We should be thinking about what type of policies do we put in place to ensure that we can assist both the children and the families to enable their children to go back to school, to ensure that they're able to continue to learn. And I think we need to be thinking about some non-traditional ways of doing this. So perhaps thinking about issues around measures such as waiving school fees or introducing school grants. I think cash transfers for households can play an important role. This will help bolster households that are experiencing shocks. And then I think a very important piece is ensuring that we're better able to provide assistive technologies to children who may be at home. And linked to the nutrition piece, what are we doing to ensure that meal programs are reaching children? And we know that in developed countries, I mean, certainly in Washington, D.C., that's been an issue. How do you ensure that kids who are home are able to have basic nutritional meals? So that's going to be an issue, I think, going forward, and an issue or a set of issues that really require some policy direction. And then, of course, as many of the speakers have mentioned, what kind of support are we providing to teachers? You know, this is going to be really important. And it is perhaps an opening, a reset moment for us to really think about how we better empower teachers and train teachers to be able to teach all children. And then I think lastly, Diane, I would just like to say that, again, stemming from the IEI report, was the whole issue around protection and safety in schools or in homes, depending on where you sit. And I think we've heard that there has been an increased number of sexual abuse and gender-based violence in the homes. This has impacted children with disabilities either directly or indirectly. And it's a factor that we need to consider, ensuring that we have those protections in place. So I guess my comments are really emphasizing a point that was made by Julia, and that's to ensure that this is a multisectoral approach that really looks at the whole child and enables us to address his or her or their specific needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlotte and Bob, you both really led into what was going to be my next question, which was recommendations. You somehow built those into your responses. So I'm going to give Julia and Joseph and Mel all a chance to give us some of their recommendations about what they see as what's needed during the recovery phase, which I hope we're going to get into soon, in order to build back better so that all children are included. Julia, I saw you were ready to go. Why don't you take it first?
Sorry about that. I was too keen, Diane.
No, we're happy that you're keen.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, I fully concur with what Charlotte was just saying there about the multisectoral approach, and great to hear the examples of how you see that's working in practice, or should work in practice. I think one thing we should do is really take stock of actually the lessons we are learning during this time. We've heard a lot about all the challenges, and it's true, there are many challenges at the moment with trying to cope with the COVID pandemic, but we do see some good practices emerging, in fact. Despite the challenges, maybe better connection with parents and teachers, for example. We see really good community support and, the use of technology that might not have happened before actually emerging in some areas. Of course, it's not across the board, but we are seeing some good practices where, websites and different platforms are starting to be more accessible for children who have visual impairment or who can't hear, or children who have intellectual disabilities, as has been mentioned, often a group that can be neglected. And there are examples of teachers and parents and others really working hard to try and include children with a variety of different needs, during this time of home learning, blended education responses while schools are closed. So I guess one big recommendation would be to make sure we don't lose any learning during this time and make sure it goes forward. Of course, there's a raft of
30
other
seconds more, Julia.
recommendations, so I won't go into all of them. I'll post some of them on the chat later that we have grouped together as an IDDC task group. So I won't go into detail of the others. Just I'll finish with the importance of disability inclusion being mandatory for donors. So any kind of, in terms of the funding issue, we can't, as was just pointed out by Bob, keep saying it's only for those who have some small difficulties. The children that are too hard to reach, we can't include those. That's not an excuse, and therefore we need the funding to go with it. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Julia. Joseph, I'm going to give you 2 minutes as well. What recommendations do you have?
Thank you, Diane. I think after COVID, we're going to have a lot of looking at what happened with remote and online learning, right? So what was inclusive quality education, and what did it look like during the pandemic? And was it inclusive or quality at all? So I think that we need to have a look at the technology and not always look at it as a savior and something of convenience. So we need to look at the experience for people with disabilities, because a lot of children with disabilities and their families need to be consulted about what their experience has been. And if it has been effective at all, we need to bring that forward and look at that as quality inclusive education, or at least a part of it. And that's how we can build back better. Thank you.
Thank you. Mel, we gave you the first word. I'm going to give you the last word among the panelists.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed listening to the expertise that we've got at this table, if you will. What a resource we've got. I suppose I continue to worry about the barriers in our minds, and especially the barriers of fragmentation. I mean, just to briefly revisit history, most of us remember 1990, the launch of Education for All. What a fabulous phrase. 1994, the Salamanca Conference, to ask what's the role of special needs education in Education for All. Did it therefore imply, as I think it did, that Education for All meant education for almost all? Because of course there are another group of children who have to be looked after and dealt with separately. And I think we all have to be thinking about, are we part of the solution, or are we unintentionally part of the problem? The danger of keep using phrases like disability inclusion, unintentionally it implies the problem is the child. Now, the paradigm shift that I think has been going on, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, is to recognize this is not about barriers within children, it's barriers within context. So we have to make arrangements to work with the system, with teachers and policymakers, around the view that difference is not a problem. Difference is actually a catalyst for innovation and change, that if we use it, will make a difference. I give a very brief example from my own city here in Manchester. There are 153 languages spoken in our schools. Over 60% of our children are bilingual. Not so many years ago, that was seen as an enormous problem. The system has matured and recognized, of course it creates problems sometimes, but overall it is a stimulus and a resource for creativity, so that we work in new ways that will benefit all children. Remember what I said, inclusion and equity is the road to excellence.
Thank you so much. Perfect. And I really appreciate your critique of the term disability inclusion, because often that is a barrier to thinking about full inclusion. And certainly what we're talking about, what UNESCO, what Leonard Cheshire, what the government of Portugal are promoting, is inclusion, fully inclusive systems where learners with disabilities are also included. We have some concluding remarks today. I'm going to ask all of our speakers to keep their remarks short, please, to 3 minutes each. But we're lucky to have with us today His Excellency Mr. Antonio Novoa, who's the ambassador of the permanent delegation of Portugal to UNESCO. And let me first, before you start speaking, express my personal thanks to you and to the government of Portugal for your leadership. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. Many thanks to all the organizers of this symposium. Thank you to all the participants for the quality of the contributions of the reflections. Thank you very much to all. And now I will switch to French to my statement. Je tiens à vous dire un mot et un
I
seul
would
mot.
like to say one word to you all, and that is obrigado. Obrigado has a very precise meaning in Portuguese. It's a way of saying thank you, but it means we are obliged, much obliged. We are obrigado. We are obliged. We're obliged to do what we're doing and to share it with you. These last 3 days have been extraordinary for exchanging ideas, experience, our commitments. I guess that there are skeptics out there who might say, oh, all it is words. It's just a conversation. Or yes, or actually worse, might they say it's even a remote conversation. And they say conversations don't change things. And yes, it's true, it's a conversation. And yet it's a dialogue. It's changing people, and it's people who change reality. And each and every one of us has a part to play in this. So no matter how small a difference, it's those differences that make people able to change things, to bring about changes in policy and our praxis. And that's exactly what's happened over these last 3 days. They've really brought out the best in humanity. In other words, the ability to understand, to valorize difference, the capacity of promoting inclusion, our collective understanding that the right to education is indeed an inclusive, the right to inclusive education is the basis for all human rights. In other words, if you look at those wonderful words of the fabulous cinematographer Jean-Luc Godard. He said about margins, he said, the margin is what actually holds all of our pages together. And I think that that's actually quite an extraordinary statement. Yes, it is in the margins that we can really define who we are. The margins support us. They enable us to live together despite our differences. They enable us to really live as one. And the same as in education. If we're going to build quality, inclusive education, it's not the rules or the canons that hold it together, but rather plurality, diversity, difference. It's a difference that really enables each and every person's contribution to be meaningful. It's in the relationship and cooperation with empathy. That's what enables us to live together, to live one with another. And Antonio Damasio, one of our neuroscientists, who's been very influential, wrote a book called Feeling and Knowing. And he was saying that there is no knowing without feeling. It's the feeling that leads to knowing. And it's our feelings towards others that are decisive in our process of learning, of knowing. In other words, without the difference that exists between us, there would be no such thing as education. We would not be able to learn from one another. So, my dear colleagues, my dear friends, just to come back to what we were saying at the very beginning, yes, this has been a wonderful conversation. And maybe some would say it's just a conversation, but what a wonderful conversation. And, it's exactly what the doctor ordered in these difficult times and these days when it becomes even more challenging to overcome our fears and hatred and see ourselves as part of a common humanity. There is no such thing as inclusion or equality unless the two are together. There's no equality without inclusion and vice versa. So thank you on behalf of Portugal. Thank you to one and all. Obrigado.
Ambassador, I think that everyone who heard you is wishing that we could bring you to our own countries and have you speak to more leaders with that passion, that there is no equality without inclusion and no inclusion without equality. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Tiziana Oliva, who's the Managing Director of Global Influencing and Programs at Leonard Cheshire, one of our sponsors. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So thank you everyone, actually. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Learner Cheshire, I would like to thank UNESCO and the Government of Portugal for partnering with us in hosting this symposium. Thank you also to everyone else who participated and contributed to it. This year, more than ever, we've been reminded of the value of coming together in partnership. And this is what this symposium was. It has brought together stakeholders that are crucial in realizing SGD4. It is clear it is through partnership and collaboration that we can reach our common goal of supporting and empowering children and youth with disabilities to realize their full potential. And we cannot build back better without them at the center of our interventions and without making sure that all children are learning better and in a safe manner. And all means all. All children means all children with disabilities. We here play a critical role in the value chain of inclusive education, and it is through coordinated efforts among governments, communities, schools, and organizations of persons with disabilities that progress can be made. We at Learner Cheshire remain committed to the inclusive education agenda, and we are keen to work in partnership. We also share Edin Dopu's resolve that there is no contradiction between someone with a disability and being an economically productive citizen of society. That when we harness the potential of all people, then we are able to lead and shape the trajectory of humanity. 2021 will be a crucial year globally for inclusive education, with the GP replenishment and G7, both hosted in the UK, as well as the preparation for the 2022 Global Disability Summit. Education will therefore be at the center of attention, and we need everyone to be reminded that we all have a role to play in ensuring that children with disabilities and their families are not left behind. Learner Cheshire is committing to play its part in building more resilient, flexible, inclusive and gender-responsive societies and education systems, taking into consideration intersectionalities, as outlined in the 2020 Global Education Meeting Declaration. We have a duty to individually and collectively fulfill the UNCRPD and make sure that every child fulfills the right to inclusive quality education and can transition from the classroom to the job market. The COVID-19 pandemic, with its challenges, also presented us with a unique opportunity to walk the talk as we build back better in an inclusive manner. It is now or never. Thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to working with you all.
Thank you so much for those comments. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Maki Hayashikawa, who's the Director of the Division for Education 2030, the education sector at UNESCO. Maki, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I hope you can hear me well.
We hear you not bad, and we can't see you.
Oh, I cannot see you anymore. My camera, I'm turning it on again. Do you see me now?
I do not see you.
Oh dear.
But maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to go ahead.
Let's go ahead. Yes,
Thank you.
My visual representation.
Oh, there you are.
Oh,
we found you. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, well, let me follow my predecessors to also start by thanking the Ministry of Education of Portugal, the Ambassador of Portugal to UNESCO, Mr. Antonio Novoal, and Learner Cheshire for the close cooperation and support in organizing this three-day event. I wish also to thank all the speakers who contributed to this event for the richness of their contributions. Over the past 2 days, which I tried to follow myself as well, we heard a lot of inspiring ideas, innovative policies and strategies, as well as a strong appeal to accelerate efforts to fully realize the right to quality and inclusive education for all. And as we have repeatedly heard, all means all, and not just for the few. Let me also thank our illustrator, Julia Hayes, for providing a great overview of the discussion that took place the past 2 days. And I really enjoyed also looking at the illustrations, which really summarized to capture the whole discussion in such a well-presented manner. Let me just highlight a few points, an important point that were addressed during the symposium. Including learners with disability education is a right and not just a moral, economic, or social imperative, though they are equally important. It has also been too long that this issue has been treated as a marginal theme and how some learners can be integrated in regular education. I think that Inclusive education should explore now how to transform education systems in order to remove the barriers that prevent pupils from participating, students, learners participating fully in education. And we also heard that the list of barriers is long, and we need to transform attitudes, curriculum, teachers' education, physical barriers, violence, bullying, language and communication, socioeconomic factors, funding, and the organizational education system, and the list goes on and on. But overcoming these barriers also call for concerted efforts to foster inclusion, which should start with renewed political will. I think here we are all convinced that inclusive education has a very central place in global sustainable development. However, we only have 10 years to go to meet our common ambitious goal to ensure quality and inclusive education throughout life for all. So we really cannot wait any longer. We must take action and move forward our efforts now. Whether you are a decision maker, a policy maker, a researcher, or a practitioner, teachers, or socially responsible partner, please do whatever you can to make the right to education of learners with disabilities a reality from today onwards. I thank you again for your participation, active contribution, and we very much look forward to our future collaboration to the cause of inclusion. Thank you very much. Muito obrigada and merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mackie. And now we have some last words that are going to come to us by video from Miss Titiporn Prawachirai, who's from the Network of Music and Arts for Persons with Disabilities in the Kingdom of Thailand. Can you start the video, please?
Hello everyone, my name is Titiporn Prawachirai. You can call me Mai. I am one of Leonard Churchill Youth Lead Advocates in Thailand. I am currently pursuing my study in Master in Inclusive Education. Today, I am pleased to share my thoughts through this video to everyone. As you all know, we are now living in a different world because of COVID, and the risk that we will be left behind is greater than ever, but that cannot happen. We are still too often underrepresented, forgotten and ignored, and our right to education is often denied. The symposium was a great opportunity to bring together speakers to discuss measures and interventions that have a concrete and big impact on the lives of millions of people with disabilities across the world. We have a collective responsibility to work with governments to make sure policies are in place, support teachers so they can support us, prevent discrimination and bullying at school, and to make sure people with disabilities are at front and at the center of this process. Symposiums like this are a cry for action, and we hope you can take home with a simple message. Every child has a right to quality education, and children with disabilities have the exact same right as any children. Thank you very much. Bye everyone.
That was a great message to end with. I just want to make some final remarks. I want to extend my own personal thanks to the organizers, the interpreters, the speakers, and the participants. And I just want to reflect on the fact that my personal commitment to inclusive education, which came out of a desire to promote human rights, really was solidified when I saw that classrooms that were inclusive provided the best education for all learners. And I truly believe that inclusive education is the best education for all. I was really happy that throughout these 3 days, we heard some excellent ideas, we heard some excellent examples, but we also still have much to do. I worry about Bob's comment about the fact that many systems still think about situations that are considered low-hanging fruit, the easiest to serve. And that means that those who systems maybe have the most trouble thinking about how to support are the ones who get farthest left behind. I think, for example, that we had an excellent session on bullying and violence, but we never touched the fact that many persons with disabilities, particularly those who have certain kinds of disabilities, may have behaviors that are not understood by others, especially if they don't have ways of communicating. And often their different ways of acting are used as an excuse to keep them out of school. So the whole idea of whether we really have zero reject policies and whether we really mean that all learners get to go to school is a huge challenge. If we want to build a stronger global disability education system post-COVID-19, let's not put new bricks on an old and weak foundation. Let's follow the example of our host, the government of Portugal, and use the experience of including learners with disabilities to build an inclusive system for all. May 2021 be a year in which we ensure the right to quality inclusive education for children with disabilities within fully inclusive systems. And may we move from the commitments of the Salamanca Declaration, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Sustainable Development Goals, the GEM Report 2020, and the Global Education Ministers Meeting of 2020 to action. Thank you all for your attention. Now let's go out and make inclusion a reality. Goodbye, everybody.